You have fallen into Event Horizon with John Michael Godier. In today's episode, John is joined by John Gertz. John Gertz is the president and CEO of Zorro Productions Incorporated. He is a leader in the field of SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, having served 3 times as chairman of the board of the SETI Institute, and he has published a number of theoretic papers in peer-reviewed astronomical journals and is the author of the new book, Reinventing SETI, New Directions in the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. He is also an amateur astronomer, classical pianist, beekeeper, mycologist, and an organic vegetable gardener. He has served on innumerable non-profit boards and as president of 5.
And we're back with John Gertz, longtime SETI alumnus. John, when did you first get into SETI?
Well, I've had an interest in SETI. I was an amateur astronomer and an interest in SETI, but I really got deeply into the field when I met Jill Tarter. As it happens, Jill Tarter lives in Berkeley, California. So do I. We were introduced over dinner, and I had a wonderful dinner with her and her husband, Jack Welsh, who's recently passed. And during the course of the dinner, I think they understood that I really had a good layman's understanding of their field. One thing led to another, and I was invited eventually to serve on the board of the SETI Institute in Mountain View, California, which at that time was the preeminent SETI research facility, and really to this day also is. I then served on the board from the year 2000 to I believe 2012, eventually becoming chairman of the board. I served 3 terms as the chairman of the board and left that to found an entirely new group with the aim of raising $100 million for SETI research worldwide. I was the president of it. Frank Drake was my vice president. We had 2 Nobel laureates and a MacArthur Genius Fellow on the board, and many of the preeminent figures in SETI at the time also serving on the board. When Yuri Milner stepped forward with the gift of $100 million, which was, we had thought we would be raising it for many people, and it turned out just one person stepped forward with a gift. We went out of business, so we had fulfilled our function. And those members of the board, many of the members of the board, either became principal investigators for the Breakthrough Listen project, or like myself, members of the advisory board that advised Yuri on how best to spend that $100 million. I'm it was and still am the only lay person on that board. So I've been involved with SETI for approximately 25 years, although my interest in the subject predates that also.
It's interesting and this should be noted, is that a lot of people say that we shouldn't be wasting taxpayer funding on SETI, but there isn't any taxpayer funding. There was only,
right.
Actually, I believe less than 1 year back in the 90s, NASA funded it, and a congressman got it all defunded, and it didn't even go a year. And that was it. That's the sole, at least in the United States. I don't know what's going on.
That is correct. In the United States, there's effectively no public funding for SETI. It's all comes through private donations, for either to the SETI Institute, which received its own bequest, or through the Breakthrough Foundation, is the vast preponderance of SETI funding here in the United States today. However, as you may know, this administration has proposed a drastic cut in NASA's budget. We don't know today, as I'm speaking, exactly which programs will be affected, but most likely those programs that directly search for life in the solar system will probably be very badly hit with budget cuts. So I would make a plea with sort of like giving up the ghost of that argument. And although I'm opposed, I'm sure, to most or all of those cuts, but leaving that aside for the moment, why shouldn't NASA now think to fund SETI? After all, the entire SETI budget in the world today is probably in the order of magnitude of about $12 million a year, give or take a little. Okay, compare that to NASA's budget of $25 billion, likely to be cut to possibly as low as $18, $19 billion. the $10 million or $12 million that we spend on SETI is a rounding error in that regard. And truthfully, if most of that money that NASA's spending to find life is not to find intelligent life, they're not funding SETI, but rather to find microbial life. So missions to Europa, missions perhaps to go through geysers shooting off of Enceladus, maybe a mission to the clouds of Venus, maybe a mission to dig, for microbial fossils or extant microbes under the soils of Mars. Fascinating in its own stuff. I hope they find a microbe, but it's only a microbe. Nobody has any realistic expectations of finding anything more. And were we to find so much as a single microbe in our solar system that is sui generis, in other words, it's not Earth-style life based upon our DNA and RNA and so forth and the same amino acids, but really uniquely different life, so it had a different origin, then it would immediately beg the question of SETI, because it would prove that life must be ubiquitous throughout the universe, and therefore intelligent life is likely there as well. So we can almost leapfrog the question of microbial life to the much more interesting question of intelligent life, and do so for pennies on the no, not pennies, less than a penny on the dollar of what NASA is spending in the search for microbial life. So spend the money now, or you're going to be spending it later anyway. And if budgets are cut for the search for microbial life, then it's more cost effective anyway to put the money into SETI. So, and on top of it, it's wrong that NASA should be the one funding SETI. The real natural funder of SETI is actually the Defense Department. Why the Defense Department? Because SETI is actually situational awareness in the military sense of the word. For goodness sakes, we need to know what's out there, for good or for bad, and we're completely blind.
Yeah, it's space situational awareness. Now, it's worth noting, just for comparison for people that aren't in the US, the amount of money spent on SETI each year is less than a single high-end house in Los Angeles.
That's probably true, yeah.
Yeah, I think it is, actually. I mean, so if you're going to go buy Steven Spielberg's house or something like that, that's going to cost you more than what SETI is being privately given worldwide. And the payoff is amazing, because if you actually do demonstrate the existence of intelligent alien life, that's the most profound discovery of human history, right there. We are not alone. But even if you find a microbe, and this is what I wanted to latch on to, because there's actually two ways to do this. Number one, you can go and look at Mars for microbes, and there are plenty of hints that maybe there was or is something there. Everything from the labeled release experiment from Viking all the way to bacterial mats, what appear to be bacterial mats that a scientist identified on Mars. Mm-hmm. But we also have abiogenesis research. And if it turns out that abiogenesis is much simpler and out pops an organism from a test tube, and if it turns out that process is way simpler than we thought, which is sort of moving in that direction, it must be everywhere. So you have two ways to determine the likelihood of alien life just from a microbe. That's all you need. But again, that would, if it's ubiquitous and we live in a microbial universe where life pervades it, the chances of it being intelligent every so often is rather high, I think. And that's what my own view on this is that the solution to the Fermi Paradox, if there is indeed a paradox, is simply that intelligence is rare. Life's not, but intelligence is. Now, what are your thoughts on that? And what specifically do you think are the flaws of things like the Drake equation and the Fermi Paradox? Are they framing the question wrong?
Well, which one do you want to take first? I'll take the Fermi's paradox, if that's okay, first. First of all, it's not a paradox. It doesn't fit the Webster definition of a paradox. And second of all, it's apocryphal. We don't really know what the date of that lunch is in which Fermi asked that big question, where is everybody? We don't know the date. We don't know the participants. But third of all, Fermi never tried to argue that SETI is a failed enterprise, or it won't succeed, or how come we haven't received a signal anymore, because he made the statement allegedly in the year 1950. That was 10 years before Frank Drake conducted the first SETI experiment. So there was no SETI. What he seemed to be referring to was the UFO phenomenon at the time that was in all the newspapers at that particular time. He was in Los Alamos, not very far from Roswell, and saying, if space travel was so easy, then how come we don't see spacecraft all the time? Where are they all? That was a fair question, but it's an entirely different question than why aren't we getting a SETI signal? So the term Fermi's paradox actually was devised more than 25 years later, approximately. Nobody knows exactly where it came from, but it seemed to be in the year 1977, 78 or something that the first use of the term was being made, and it stuck somehow. But it was made on behalf of, or to describe the phenomenon that Michael Hart described in his famous counter-revolutionary 1975 paper, which basically argued that ET does not exist, because if ET did exist, we would see their spacecraft everywhere here in our own solar system, because if you simply run out the math on it, if an alien civilization sent a spacecraft towards two of its nearest stars in opposite directions and populated planets there, and then it spent 100 years or something like that building up its civilization, or 1,000 years, and then sent off two more spacecraft in two other directions, and then those four sent off 8 more, and exponentially the colonization wave would be such that they would have arrived here after merely however you plug in the numbers, something like 50 million years or 100 million years. In other words, just a tiny fraction of the life of the universe. Hence, since we don't see them, they don't exist. There is no such thing as ET. Well, that argument is deeply flawed in many different ways, primarily because it's almost impossible to actually travel between the stars with civilizations. Robotic probes can make it, but squishy beings like ourselves cannot, and we can have that discussion. But moving back to Fermi's paradox, there are very, very many solutions that have been published with regards to Fermi's paradox. I'll give you, if you want, I'll give you a couple of my favorites.
Favorites, yes. Now, interestingly, the idea of the von Neumann probe, which is what we were skirting around, the idea of the von Neumann probe means that any argument that could be made that alien life isn't here is actually on shaky ground, because you could populate the entire galaxy, every star system, within just a few million years at comfortable sublight speeds with these machines. But what I would be concerned with, and you can't probably send biology, but you can print it out when you get there. You could print out an alien if you want, in principle. Not that we could, but perhaps they could. But the problem is that when you start throwing technology into space, it gets corrupted and perhaps irrational. Bits get flipped by cosmic rays and things like that. So the older the von Neumann probe, the less I would trust it being sane. And I wonder if that is responsible for things like the UFO phenomenon, which doesn't always seem to act rationally. In other words, maybe it's not a sane phenomenon, but we'll get to that in a minute. So let's cover the Drake equation.
Okay, do you want to talk about von Neumann's for a second? I want to respond to that for a second.
Sure.
I'm going to take a contrarian point of view. I don't believe in von Neumann's. Okay. Go on the internet and search out a beautiful video that you'll find on YouTube somewhere on how to, all the inputs into the common number 2 pencil. Okay. And you have to have a forest for trees to make the wood. You need a mining operation to get the graphite. You need a mining operation for the metal you need a rubber plantation for the eraser. You need a paint factory for the yellow paint. Now let's look at this. In order to get the wood, you don't just need a forest, you need a chainsaw. But a chainsaw has 1,000 components inside of it, and each of those has to be manufactured. Then a rubber tree demands a certain amount of microbes in the soil with which it has symbiosis. The, and on and on and on. It's inputs on top of inputs on top of inputs on top of inputs. I don't believe that a von Neumann can simply land on an asteroid and somehow manufacture all of those inputs that are required to replicate itself. It's an enormously difficult proposition, and on top of it, it may be illegal. It may very well be that there is an intergalactic internet, as I posit in my book, but that internet is there mostly to not just to pass cultural news around, which most civilizations cannot possibly understand other civilizations. In other words, we play basketball, they have waggle dances, or the way they change colors is for them communicatively interesting or enjoyable, and we have nothing in common to speak about. But one thing that we may have in common is the need to share the galaxy peacefully. And for that, we need law. And that law may be comprised of simply two articles. Article 1 says in Klingon, or whatever the lingua franca is
Let's go with
in
Klingon.
the galaxy, don't come, stay still, or you come, you die. It could be as simple as that. Don't move off your home turf. That's verboten. That is the first law. The second law may be do not create von Neumann replicas, because like Mickey's broom in Fantasia, it could replicate and replicate and replicate and completely gobble up all the useful matter in the galaxy. So there may be actual law against it.
The paperclip machine, where it turns everything into paper clips, and that's that. I think another possible one, as far as galactic law goes, is artificial intelligence, artificial generalized intelligence, actual, real, sapient machines. I don't think that's a good idea to allow that anywhere for galactic security. Is to avoid von Neumann probes and avoid especially artificially intelligent living ones.
Okay, so I'm going to say to that look, I argue in my book that our solar system is populated by artificial probes. They have to be, to some degree or another, artificially intelligent. However, they may not be empowered to do much of anything. In other words, and one viable solution to Fermi's paradox, I hate that term, let's call it David Brin's The Great Silence. One viable solution to the Great Silence is that those probes are here in our solar system right now. They are surveilling us, they're understanding us, and they're uploading data through the galactic internet, sending it to sister probes around other stars that act as relay stations or communication nodes backwards to some home civilization for authorization to act. In other words, they're looking for instructions, and unless they get instructions from the squishy beings or whoever is their puppet masters, they won't make contact with us. Maybe they've seen the nightly news and thrown some yellow police tape around us saying it's a wretched place, stay out, but they're not going to destroy us either without authority to do so. And it could be, if the progenitor civilization is 1,000 light years away, that it could be another 2,000 years before we hear anything from the probes that may be sitting as close as the moon or Mars or someplace else in our own solar system. Nobody said that, nobody promised us that, and this is especially to the METI people, that we're all going to find out the truth of alien life in our generation. We may be just a transitional generation that has to pass the ball on to the next generation.
Well, that's what I think. I try not to be a civilization or a technological chauvinist, and I tend to think that we still have a lot of room for growth, and this world and human civilization will look very different in 3 centuries than it does now, and that we will look something like the year 1725. looks to us. Look at those people with their weird hats, things like that. So I'm very careful to leave open that maybe the reason that we haven't heard from aliens is we're not there yet. We're not worth talking to. Or maybe we're worth watching, but we're not quite to the point where we need any sort of guidance or anything. But I will tell you about a pipe dream that I have as a science fiction author. I would absolutely love it if those nodes existed, those communications nodes, and that they were actually data centers, and that they hold vast quantities of information about life in the Milky Way, that it can eventually, when we get to the point where it likes us, it'll tell us, and then all of a sudden we have everything from pictures of dinosaurs they took when they were visiting here 68 million years ago, or they tell us about every species they've ever identified in the galaxy, or things like that. And that would be enough for me. I don't need to contact them. I just need that information. Would be very useful.
Now, this is you've inferentially made an important point here. As we're uploading all our information to the galactic internet, whether we want to or not, they're taking it. We're giving them our data, whether we want to or not. It's being uploaded, and it's being dispersed across the galaxy to various, let's call it, for lack of a better term, server farms where it sits, such that two important things happen. One is redundancy, that all of the culture and knowledge and information of the galaxy is being stored redundantly, so that if one data center, if you will, or one civilization is wiped out by a supernova or a gamma ray burst or something bad, the knowledge is still safe. It's somewhere else. It's everywhere. The second important point of this is that knowledge continues to grow, irrespective of the number of extant civilizations currently residing within the galaxy. Just as the number of books in the Library of Congress grows every year, irregardless of whether or not, or how many authors are still alive. So after a civilization runs its course and goes extinct, if it has to, that civilization's vital information is still stored.
Well, it makes sense. It's one of those things where when trying to envision alien civilizations, you try to envision commonalities, because if you're looking for a radio signal, a SETI signal, you have to assume that they have a transmitter, which means they have science and engineering in order to build such a thing.
Yep.
And in METI, that they would even be able to receive such a thing. So that would be a commonality. And chances are, since the universe only works certain ways, their radio telescope might look a lot like ours for practical reasons. But I mean, it might be the size of New York, but it's still in orbit or something like that. But still, there would be commonalities that the universe forces on you based on its laws and its rules.
Absolutely.
And that's one that I wonder is redundancy is going to be like that, because, why keep all of your eggs in one basket? And I think that would work for an alien too.
Yeah. That's absolutely true.
Now, everybody should check out John Gertz's new book, Reinventing SETI, New Directions in the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, which is out now by the time this video airs, and available at just about everywhere, right?
Yeah, I believe so. You can get it through my website, johngertz.com. It's available on Amazon. It's available through the publisher, Oxford University Press. Your local bookstore, I don't know. It may be there or may not be. I don't know which is your local bookstore. But it's generally available now.
And your favorite online book retailer, the gigantic behemoth online book retailer that starts with an A and is owned by Jeff Bezos.
I said you can buy it also through, and on my website, johngertz.com, there's a link directly to purchase it from Oxford University Press for those who are less inclined to go through Amazon. So the option is there.
The option is there, and you can also order it, I'm sure, anywhere.
Yeah.
But also, and before I have to tease something. We're going to go into the UFOs next, but you also have a YouTube channel, right? Tell us about that.
Oh gosh, I don't know. I mean, if you go through my website, I'm not a techie, okay? So I do have a YouTube channel, but somebody in my office who handles it. If you go to my website, johngertz.com, you can probably link to it. But there are lots of videos on my website. I think there are 25 2-minute videos, little SETI snippets of wisdom, let's call it, for the lack of a word, and longer talks that I give maybe on the 20-minute, 30-minute scale. So I think there are 17 of those currently uploaded. So they're there. it's a resource to anybody who wants to avail themselves of it. And there are links to my academic papers as well.
And there'll also be links to all of the stuff in the description below for everybody for the interested. I recommend it. And the book was good. I really enjoyed it. But
Thanks.
now to the big question, the gray elephant in the room that happens to be an alien or something of that nature. The UFO UAP phenomenon has taken a different turn in recent years, enough that I believe personally that it should be taken seriously and investigated seriously in a scientific manner. What are your thoughts on that? And is there a path for that to actually be an interaction with an alien civilization?
All right. Let me give you some of my views on it. The good news is, for those UFO fans who are tuning in, is that my book hypothesizes that ET's vastly better strategy for making contact with Earth is sending physical spacecraft here rather than sending signals from their own home planet. Further to that, I'm coming from an entirely different perspective than they are. I'm coming from the point of view of astronomy, and astronomy begins where the atmosphere ends. So I personally have no experience with UFOs. I only know about UFOs for what I've read in the newspaper. I've seen on 60 Minutes. I've never been beamed up by a UFO. I've never seen a UFO. But your UFO enthusiasts should take great heart in what I'm saying, because not being one of them, I come to a remarkably similar conclusion that ET's best strategy is to send probes here. That having been said, I'm personally quite skeptical of the evidence I've seen to date. Now, I mentioned this the last time you had me on the show, that I'll give you the example that I'm unsatisfied by the photographic evidence I've seen so far. I pointed out that each and every one of us, or almost every one of us, carries a wonderful camera in our pockets, and your listenership, or some of your listeners, wrote in the comments section, but doesn't Gertz know that a cell phone camera doesn't give a good picture of a distant object, that we're talking about a UFO flying? And that's a fair point. That's a fair point. But what I would find impressive, that even if it was a bad quality picture, if 40 strangers to one another all were sitting on the windows, in window seats on a plane, and looked out and took pictures of the same blurry dot. Okay, I don't care how bad the quality of the picture is. The fact that 40 strangers to one another all saw the same thing at the same time, that I would find impressive. And that information I at this point lacking. Additionally, there's another point here that I want to make, and that I'm a kind of mainstream press kind of guy. I'm kind of old fashioned, if you will. Okay. It's a little bit like democracy. And democracy stinks except for all the other forms of government. Well, I get frustrated with the mainstream press. When I know a subject deeply and I read an article on it, I can be very frustrated that the article, it leaves me in some respects wanting. So I get that. I really do. On the other hand, the large army of reporters out there should be to me, the first filter for information. So when I see the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, or I don't care which magazine or newspaper, publish an article on its front page to the effect of, now it's been proven UFOs exist, that I would find persuasive. So far, I'm just not seeing the evidence, and I'm just a layman. I'm not a UFO guy. But I haven't seen anything that really, I was a little bit impressed by the 60 Minutes stuff, but there wasn't a lot of corroboration. What is it? Thousands of satellites are looking down on Earth all the time. They see every single airplane. They're not seeing UFOs. There are no sonic booms associated with UFOs. Well, they're moving air molecules like any other object going through space, and they should create friction, especially at the accelerations and speeds that are purported to them. We're not hearing those sonic booms. So I'm left wanting my skepticism should be a joy and a support to those UFO enthusiasts, because despite my skepticism, you can and should say, "Wow, Gertz, he's an idiot. What does he know?" But take comfort in the fact that, coming from an entirely different perspective, I've come around to supporting you.
Well, I would say now my view on this is there is healthy skepticism, healthy scientific skepticism, which I have as well. And then there is a malicious form of skepticism that's out to call everybody cranks or whatever. And I don't agree with that position. I think that goes too far.
Nor I.
But
Nor
I,
I.
yeah, but I will look at the, any evidence presented and see, because I can't tell you the difference between an alien in the atmosphere and an alien at outside of the orbit of Jupiter. I can't tell you the difference. If there's a von Neumann probe out there, it's probably here. So, or something like that, just some idea. But I also wonder if about physicality, because sometimes, again, these things are not interacting with the atmosphere as they should. If they're performing something like hypersonic flight at extreme speeds, that comes with a lot of costs, as we know from the aerospace industry, that it's going to create a lot of heat, a lot of sonic booms, a lot of everything.
Right.
And we don't see that really with the UFO phenomenon, which makes me wonder if it's a well, number one, I mean, maybe advanced alien civilization knows stuff that we don't. There's always that possibility. You have to leave that open, that it could move through an atmosphere silently or something like that. But also that it's a spoof, and that's actually a visual phenomenon, and that maybe we don't know as much about our atmosphere as we think we do. And that was actually a point that was made by one Donald Menzel, the former head of the Department of Astronomy at Harvard, who was an arch skeptic, but he never could quite lay that down, that there was something about the atmosphere that we may not understand. And we later found out things like ball lightning exist,
Right.
and sprites and things like that.
Right.
So I would be, in some cases, temperature inversions, things like that. However, there are also overwhelming ones where it's hard to ignore, isn't with the 60 Minutes, which was the USS Nimitz and David Fravor and the pilots and all that, where there was multiple sensors.
I found that I did find that impressive, but I don't. Again, it's not my field, but I don't remember seeing any corroborative evidence that from radar or.
Well, when they went to when Arrow, the government's office for this, at least they told me when they went looking for it, the data wasn't there, and that the radar data that had been reported just no longer exists. I find that hard to believe, because if you
They no longer exist because it never did exist in the first place, So
well, might not have. You don't know. It might not have, but I don't think they would have thrown it away, because every time you screw up a radar, they're going to want that data. Whenever you can fool an Aegis cruiser's radar, you're going to want that that information on that system for as long as it's active, and you probably won't declassify it for many decades. But I leave the door is open on that, because again, I can't tell you the difference. If you can have an alien outside of the orbit of Mars, you can have one here, right?
I absolutely concede the point. The probes are here. They're in our solar system. There is no reason that I can think of why they cannot or should not go inside of our atmosphere. It's a deep gravity well. It means that they're going to have extra equipment for heat shields and so forth, and landing gear if they're going to land. Who knows? But really, there's no compelling reason why they can't come into our atmosphere from any theorizing I've ever done. So it's possible. I just haven't seen the evidence that convinces me.
Me neither. Yeah, but the thing is that if I were an alien that was studying the most interesting planet in the solar system, in the star system, that's what I would do.
Yep.
I would and if somebody saw it, there's your UFO of alien origin. So it actually is more plausible than I think it's given credit for. It's just that we don't have solid evidence, which personally I want to see a crash saucer or something.
I mean, look, you remember that meteor that came, I think it was through the southeast sky, well, it feels like about 6 weeks ago, 2 months ago. And there were probably 10 or so dash cam cameras that just made it on TV, never mind all the hundreds of dash cams that caught it, that they didn't bother airing the footage. Why don't we get that with UFOs?
Well, you would expect that, especially in places where dash cams are the norm.
Yeah.
Do you remember the Chelyabinsk meteorite that fell in Russia?
Yeah, sure.
Years ago, and there was footage everywhere.
Exactly.
Not only of it coming in, but also because the Russians all have dash cams for their insurance purposes. And not only did we have all this footage, there was footage of the shock wave, the sound wave coming off that thing and shattering building windows and knocking down a brick wall and all kinds of things.
Absolutely. But with UFOs or UAPs, it always seems to be one person on a lonely country road who sees it. Again, it's not my field. My field of astronomy begins where the atmosphere ends, So I just know what I read in the press. And so far, I haven't read anything that really persuades me with complete confidence that the phenomenon is absolutely alien of derivation.
Now, I'm going to throw you a curveball, John, because this is something that I've been thinking about lately, and I haven't completely thought it through, so feel free to poke holes in it. But I think the optimum time to look for a technosignature in the solar system isn't now. It was in the past, because if you want to get a sampling of the star system and its planets, send in something on a trajectory going through the star system in the early 1970s, so that number one, you can go through the inner solar system as you're coming through and catch some planets, close flybys, and then after that you have the grand tour alignment that Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 took advantage of. So therefore you could get your gravitational assist and everything, you get your probe in and get a good sampling of most of the planets of the star system through that, and including Earth, I think, if you did it right. So the physics of that, so that to me is the ultimate technosignatures. When we didn't have the ability to see it when this would have been cooking through in the 80s, but that would have been the ultimate time to look for a technosignature, because that was the perfect time to probe this star system if that was your goal as a scientist. Yeah.
Well, another database that is well worth looking at are old photographic plates of the sky pre-1957, pre-Sputnik.
Yes.
And
yes, Beatrice Villarroel. Yes.
And Beatrice, exactly. She did it, and she came up with a fascinating photo from the year 1950, where as clearly there shouldn't have been any satellites there, and she saw 10 in formation. The problem with it is that she didn't have access to the actual plate, but just to a digitalization of the plate. And even if she did, it's very hard to say it wasn't a damaged plate or wasn't a gamma ray burst or something.
Well, that's actually in the paper, is that she suggests that get a microscope and get the original plate.
Yes.
And let's look at the emulsion and try to figure out what this is.
I totally agree, and that's an experiment research still begs to be done, and not just from Palomar, but there are other telescopes all over the world. Apparently, there are some problems in accessing the original plates at Palomar. I'm not sure what the problem is, but Beatrice was completely unable to access those plates. But just the digitalized version.
There is something weird though in that paper that gives me pause. And full disclosure, I know Dr. Villarroel, but I was independently, I was like, this is really strange. And that is that the glints, if that is indeed what these are, and not plate flaws, you have to leave that open. But the glints actually correlate with the Earth's umbra, the shadow of the Earth, and they disappear like a satellite would. The satellite goes past the terminator and blinks out. These are doing that, and that one gave me pause in that recent flurry of papers regarding these transients.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a productive field of research, and a lot more of attention ought to be paid to it. And other researchers should be brought to bear on it. It shouldn't just be Beatrice out there by herself.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm hoping that more gets put into that. And another one, as I mentioned in the other segment, was Spilsky's star. I want to see more spectra of that thing.
Excuse me, going back to satellites for a second, I would also like somebody to look at the database of satellites to make sure that each and every one is accounted for. In other words, what we may assume is Chinese and the Chinese may assume is ours, maybe something else altogether. So
yeah, that's a can of worms.
It's a can of worms, but it's also an area of possible research, or whether an alien craft is hiding behind another craft. That's another possibility.
Well, there's a class of object called the empty trash bag objects at Bose, and what they are is they're pieces of foil from launches that get pushed around by light pressure. Basically, they're just moving around out there. They're just space junk. The problem is some of them show that they almost had to, especially one, showed that it had to have swung around the moon and come back, and it doesn't correlate with any of the Apollo or any of the other missions, the India's mission or Russia's missions or anything like. Doesn't correlate. So it shouldn't be that ETBO should not be there. And so everybody's trying to work out, or they were trying to work out, how light pressure could put it in that weird, highly elliptical trajectory. And there was never a satisfying answer to that. So it's like, well, and you mentioned also in your book, James Benford and those kinds of ideas and one of the things he brought up to me was long delayed echoes, where you have a radio signal, like a ham operator, and 7 seconds later they get an echo. Like the ionosphere could really do that. What are your views on those sorts of things? Should that be further investigated?
Yeah, Jim Benford, who I know quite well, feels that we should be looking at those particular asteroids that are in Trojan orbits with Earth. He calls them co-orbitals. I think he's partly correct that we should be looking at those. They're stable places for ET to hang out in a way that they can surveil Earth without expending, because they're gravitationally stable orbits, relatively stable orbits. They will degrade over time, but they would require far less propellant to keep them stable than if they were in some other orbits. So he's right in that regard, but really you've got to look at all the asteroids, and you can even ask a very fundamental question: how do we know that every asteroid is in fact an asteroid? What do we know about every small asteroid? For the most part, all we know is that they reflect some light, and we just assume that they're asteroids because they're in the asteroid belt. But we don't actually know for a fact that they're asteroids. One or more of them may be alien probes. So we need to look at for anomalies perhaps in the asteroid belt, such as a disproportionate amount of heat as related to the light signature. That might tell us that, and if the difference was wide enough, it might tell us or give us an indication that maybe something is worth further investigating.
I think there's a lot of areas. Speaking in the other segment, we were talking about the moon, looking for trash on the moon or past messages, or Arthur C. Clarke's monolith would be pretty easy to spot, probably. And you can do that with basically any of the bodies of that have solid surfaces in the solar system. There's just so much that we haven't done, is what I'm getting at. And what do you think a comprehensive strategy would look like to search for close technosignatures in the solar system, something that is now entering the debate and the literature?
Well, it's hopeless for human beings to study all of the data that's available. I mean, fortunately, we live in this amazing era of massive astronomical databases, absolutely massive. And I think the way forward is to look at those databases for anything whatsoever anomalous, just to use machine learning, artificial intelligence, to wade through that data bit by bit by bit and look for anything that looks anomalous. It's almost hopeless for us to try to figure out exactly what we should be looking for. So I've been asked, where to look for the probes that I posit are here in our own solar system. Yeah, there are some obvious places, like on the surface of an asteroid. There's raw material available to it for build out of capabilities or for repair. They can burrow into the regolith for protection from radiation and micrometeorites. A close orbit around the sun seems like a logical place to look. Why there? Because first of all, there's obviously an energy source. But secondly, it's very easy for sister probes to find it. If the protocol is that each probe is in close orbit to each star, then the sister probes know exactly where to aim their lasers, right directly at the other star. And the footprint for the laser will be large enough, presumably, to then encompass the sister probe or node, wherever it may be in that orbit around the sun. So that's another logical place for those probes to hang out. But the real answer is that it could be anywhere. And there may be some places that may seem more logical than others, but the best way to search for ET, and I say this in my book, is to be agnostic And if you're absolutely determined to look for radio signals coming from afar, then don't try to pick targets without any great reason to point your telescope this way or that way, but rather to mosaic the sky field of view by field of view by field of view by field of view. It takes a long time to do that, but that's the only rational way, because ET may not even be on a star. Maybe, assuming they're transmitting, they may not be transmitting from a star, maybe from a rogue planet in between the stars. A rogue planet are those planets that were thrown out of their solar systems usually during the formation phase, and there's usually Earth-size or something like that. Because the smaller planets lose the tug of war with the larger planets, and they end up being cast out of their solar systems and wander the depths of space forever. Those rogue planets are thought to be a trillion of them in our galaxy. Maybe ET is sitting on one of them. Why? Because it's the ultra cold environment is maybe wonderful for computing. But maybe it's maybe it's a rogue planet. Maybe it's from a brown dwarf in the middle. Maybe it's from a world ship that's cruising in between stars. We don't know. We have no idea, and there's no reason to point your telescope this way or that way looking for a radio signal of some beings who are intentionally transmitting to us. Now, if you're looking for technosignatures, passive technosignatures, that is to say, where ET is not trying to deliberately get our attention, but is just doing its own thing, then I say that white dwarfs are the best place to look.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that's a compelling case. But you mentioned the rogue planets, and that's something I've spent some time wondering about, because not only do you have the cold temperatures on the surface for computation, you also have radioactive decay, so you have an energy source.
Right.
And I wonder, just the prospects, let's say microbial life on a rogue planet is there, and that there could be panspermic life wandering the galaxy that's existing off of the heat from radioactive decay in the planet's core, but they're also getting blasted off, and that maybe the weirdness of life appearing at the very first moment it could on Earth is due to something along those lines.
Personally, I think there's a lot of merit in thinking of intentional panspermia as the source of life on Earth, as it may be on other planets. If my hypothesis is correct that ET's best strategy is to send robotic probes, then maybe they send robotic probes immediately upon the formation of a new solar system. And immediately upon planet formation within that new solar system, they infect those planets, those rocky planets or any planet, with a host of microbes, and let those microbes evolve as they would. And that makes us ET. We are them, essentially. And it may well be that all the life that we find is similar to us, based upon DNA and RNA and the same amino acids and so forth, simply because we're all from the same progenitor, sort of like a Johnny Appleseed who goes through the galaxy and seeding it. That may be what's going on here. I can't find a logical reason why not. And really the kind of the not the proof of it, but an indication that it may be true is that the universe, the Earth formed life almost from the very first instant of its own possibility. It's just it was very, very quick in getting started here on planet Earth. And one has to ask the question, how did that happen so quickly?
Well, and the other thing is that if it is indeed indigenous and was not panspermically deposited here, that it arises under the conditions, the very end of the late heavy bombardment. And that would suggest to me that it's easy.
Right.
That there's something about abiogenesis that's really simple that we're missing.
And there's a growing body of evidence that life began well before the late bombardment. So the late bombardment ended, I believe, about 700 million years after the formation of the Earth. But life may be yet older than that, and it may have survived the bombardment.
Yeah.
And there's certainly some real indications of that. In other words, one way or the other, it got started almost at the first instant it could get started. And either way, either way.
Either way, though, if it's panspermic or if it was just really, really very simple chemistry that starts it off, which I mentioned earlier that it's moving in that direction. If you look at work by Deemer and Damer, they're finding that they were doing experiments basically looking at thermal pools, hot water pools in the Kamchatka region of Russia that was consistently drying out and then rehydrating, drying out, rehydrating. And they found that something very similar, basically soap bubbles, appear that look a lot like cell walls, lipids. And that they think that it was actually just a hot spring.
Yeah.
Well, at the same time, there was also that work that was done that showed that if you percolate nutrients through volcanic glasses of a certain type, basaltic glasses, out comes RNA strands. Just out of nowhere. There they are. So you do that enough, many trillions of times, presumably, you're going to get something cohesive. And it might end up in one of those, since volcanic glasses and volcanic hot springs are in the same place, that you might end up with the conditions of life happening much, much simpler than we thought. And that we were actually erring with abiogenesis research for the last however many decades since the Miller-Urey experiments, that it was actually, we were looking at a much harder process, thinking it was much harder than it actually is. And that it might just simply pop out of there under the right conditions. But for a long time, they were spiraling way out there, like radioactive beaches with higher uranium and things like that, those types of theories. But it seems that they were simply overcooking the turkey, and that it might be very, very simple. What are your views on that?
I agree completely. I think that we're going to determine that life really is easy to get going. That doesn't mean that it wasn't intentionally planted here, but one way or the other, my strong guess is that life is pretty ubiquitous. I think we're going to find it in the clouds of Venus. I think we're going to find it in the regolith of Mars, either extant or extinct. I think we're going to find it in the plumes of Enceladus. I think we're going to find it on Europa. I think that life is pretty ubiquitous, and that's my personal guess.
My personal guess as well, and I will take it a little bit further, that I think that microbial life is ubiquitous and pervades the universe. It's everywhere. Everywhere it can get a foothold. And then if it can't get a foothold, it eventually colonizes, especially if you're dealing with something like a red dwarf system that lasts for trillions of years and has plenty of interactions with these, objects, perhaps interstellar. I would imagine that we live in a microbial universe, but I don't hold the same view towards intelligence, and that may be very rare. I leave that open, that it's extremely rare.
By intelligence, I think you mean technological intelligence.
Technological intelligence.
Okay, because intelligence, you have slime mold that can
which
find
you
a way
don't.
through.
You can be we have to give. Yeah, we got to give the octopus its due.
Yes.
Here, that intelligence, but try to get an octopus to smelt metal in its environment. That's going to be hard.
That's the but for the asteroid argument. Okay, that is to say, if it weren't for that asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs 65 million or 66 million years ago, the little rat-sized mammals that were hanging around in between scurrying in between the toes of the big dinos would never have evolved into us, essentially. Okay. Well, the problem with that argument is that the dinosaurs might have evolved into technological creatures. Certainly, just before the asteroid hit Earth and wiped out the dinosaurs, there were species of dinosaurs, small raptors with brain casings that were much larger than the average dinosaur, who hunted in pack, who had small manipulative hands. There's several species of raptors that fit that description. I'll tell you, if we were living back then, most of us would have bet on these guys evolving technology, not the little shrew-like things crawling up trees and and digging in burrows. Moreover, if we go extinct, I'm not a big fan of the Drake equation, even though Frank was a good friend of mine. But I'll give him his due when Frank would make the point that if we Homo sapiens go extinct, his bet is on the raccoons to come up next. And I think I think it's a good case that for the raccoons, they have manipulative hands. They hunt in packs. They are highly intelligent. They're omnivores. I think a good case could be made for the raccoons coming up next. The point being that we human beings, Homo sapiens, yeah, we're king of the hill right now, but we're not indispensable. The dinos could have been here, but for the asteroids, been where we are launching satellites, and they may have done it earlier. It may have not taken them an extra 66 million years to come to arrive at technology. And if we go, somebody else will come behind us, maybe the raccoons or maybe somebody else.
Well, I can tell you with high confidence that a raccoon can open a trash can.
Yes.
And yes, and it happens to me often.
Yes.
But I still love them. I rather like the raccoons.
Yeah, and of course I'm speaking about not raccoons per se, but whatever raccoons evolved into might be technological.
Yeah, and I doubt that the alien civilization, which we're someone else's alien civilization, so the raccoon civilization on Earth that someone else sees as aliens, I don't know that they're going to call themselves raccoons. They're probably going to come up with their own term, so to speak. Maybe the trash people. But all right, John, it's always a pleasure, and I hope you come back, because we could talk for hours about this type of stuff, because I really wonder what's out there. For the last 35, 40 years, I've been wondering, and I am honestly no closer to knowing than I was back then.
I mean, it's a little sad. We're all perhaps a little like Moses, not allowed to get into the promised land. You know, we just may not be among the generation. And I've seen the first generation of SETI researchers have now passed. Some of them, like Frank Drake, who I love personally, was a great man. Personally, I just disagree with the Drake equation and write a lot about that in my book. But who went out with a irascible smile on his face, and others who are sort of like bitter, and depressed, and just that they're not the ones to have found ET, or flinging Hail Marys by suggesting that we do METI, and trying to, since they're not communicating with us, we're going to communicate with them. There's sort of they're pathetic figures in my view. So that's it, John. You and I may not be of that generation, but we'll pass the torch to the next.
It will. Not discovering alien life within the next 20 years will save Seth Shostak a lot of money, because he has promised to buy everyone a cup of coffee upon the discovery, and he thinks it'll happen within 20 years.
No, excuse me, but Seth actually does it the opposite. He says that, he's willing to bet a cup of coffee. He'll take the coffee. He's going to be caffeinated up the kazoo. But that I don't understand Seth, because he's also a proponent of METI. Since he's predicting, in front of audiences, he's predicting that we'll discover SETI within the next 10 years or 20 years. This number varies, but it always presumably within his lifetime. But at the same time, he advocates for METI, and I don't get that. Be patient. If you really think that we're going to discover ET in the next 20 years, what the hell do you have to, proactively try to transmit to the stars? Patiently wait and continue with your SETI experiments.
This is why I bleat on about microbial universe ideas, because I think that I will make the prediction within 20 years, I'll bet we crack abiogenesis, and then we'll know this is either hard and must be very rare, or it's very common and it'll be everywhere. But people are doing those experiments. People are looking into it.
No, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, John, because even if it's going to be extremely difficult to get life going, it doesn't destroy the hypothesis of interstellar panspermia. It may be precisely because ET knows that life is so rare that first ET looked around itself and said, the universe is empty. We were a fluke. It will always be empty. We don't like that. Let's impregnate the entire galaxy. So that's possible.
There has been those ideas in science fiction. I believe there was an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation that did that, and then also the Mass Effect game series actually sort of hinted that maybe such a thing happened. But the fact is that if you can just find out in a laboratory here on Earth through, the successors of the Miller-Urey experiments, and out pops a microbe, you will know this is either easy or it is hard. And you can do that relatively cheaply, even cheaper than going to Mars and Europa, drilling into it. That's not going to happen anytime soon, especially as you mentioned in this climate. I'm particularly worried about the Nancy Grace Roman telescope, to be honest with you, because it's finished, ready to go, and could get
totally agree
cut.
It's very
and that's not even a political statement. That was the reuse of a mirror that was paid for by the government already, taxpayers, and it was repurposed from intelligence to NASA, and it's finished and ready to go, ready to launch, and may not happen. And I'm like, that's 2 wastes right in a row.
Yeah.
And so I do worry about those things. All right, John, it's always a pleasure to speak to you, and I look forward to doing it again. And I got another question for you, though.
All right.
When's the next Zorro movie?
All right. Okay. All right. Well, I'm working on quite a few of them right now simultaneously, but that's if I told you I'd have to kill you, you know that.
Oh, of course, and then carve a Z in my T-shirt.
No, if you go to our website Zorro.com, you'll get a sense of what we're doing with the Zorro property right now.
That's absolutely fascinating to me, by the way. Zorro, managing the Zorro franchise on top of SETI and thinking about alien life. I like it.
Thanks, John. John, it's always been a pleasure to appear on your show. Thank you so much for having me. All the best.
Event Horizon and my channel are now available as a podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube memberships. Early ad-free episodes, bonus episodes, and sleep-focused content. Sign up now by clicking the links below to your platform of choice.